This video is a short how-to session on using multiple property documents, or MPDs, in Oregon. This session is part of a larger project led by the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office to evaluate and encourage the use of multiple property documentation forms in the state of Oregon. Many of you are familiar with the typical process of nominating a property or a historic district to the National Register of Historic Places through the completion of a National Register nomination form. In that nomination form, the preparer must establish the property or district's significance within its historical context. This can encompass multiple historical and architectural themes, making for a long and time-intensive document. The MPD, however, offers a different way to nominate properties that ultimately reduces the amount of documentation needed for each nomination. How so? Well, the MPD form serves as sort of a cover document to collect information on related properties and to evaluate the National Register eligibility of those related properties. Then, individual National Register nominations with the necessary property-specific research are completed using the context and evaluation framework in the MPD. MPDs can be used over and over again to nominate related properties, not just at the time the MPD is submitted. An MPD form takes a group of related properties, like historic lighthouses or historic bridges, across a particular geographical area and identifies common themes, trends, and patterns of history for that group of properties. An MPD's geographic scope can be limited to a single neighborhood or community or can cover a broad geographic range. Ultimately, an MPD provides the framework for either the simultaneous or future listings of related properties. It's important to highlight the differences between historic districts and MPDs and to emphasize that they're not interchangeable. Historic districts are typically defined by a contiguous boundary that encircles a concentration of resources that are linked historically or aesthetically, like a downtown or a neighborhood. Resources within historic districts are significant as part of the district's collection of resources and may not be individually eligible for the National Register. However, properties nominated as part of an MPD must be individually eligible for the National Register, as outlined by the MPD's registration requirements. These properties must be able to stand on their own. Further, properties nominated as part of an MPD are not required to be geographically linked. For example, a post office in Bend and a school in Salem can both be nominated under the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, provided they meet the MPD's registration requirements. These four sections, A, B, C, and D, are found on the cover page of an MPD. Section A is the name of the MPD. Section B lists the associated historic context used to produce the MPD. Section C lists the MPD authors and the date it was prepared, and Section D provides the certification information that is completed by the SHPO and National Register staff. These 5 sections make up the bulk of the MPD form. Section E includes the long, footnoted narratives that present the history, patterns, and trends that relate to and tie together the group of properties. Section F is where the group of properties are divided into property types that are defined by common characteristics. Section G provides the geographic boundaries of the area covered by the MPD. Section H is where the nomination preparer describes their research methods. And Section I is the bibliography of major sources used to produce the various parts of the MPD. That's all the pieces of the MPD form. If you're submitting a new MPD form, it must be accompanied by at least one individual nomination, together called a multiple property submission or a multiple property nomination. Make sure to familiarize yourself with the MPDs that cover resources in your community, and don't overlook those statewide MPDs like the New Deal era resources and Black Historic Resources MPDs. If you think a property may fit within an existing MPD, begin by confirming that the resource is within the geographic scope, or Section G, and matches with a property type noted in Section F. If so, reach out to the SHPO staff to discuss the registration requirements for the property type and to confirm eligibility before preparing a nomination. A nomination preparer should use the MPD in a couple of ways: as a source of information to be referenced in the text like any other source, and also as a guide for justifying a property's eligibility under the registration requirements. Keep in mind these MPDs are rich with history and can be used as reference material for nominations that aren't directly linked to the MPD or for other historic resource needs, like compliance reviews or interpretive projects. A nomination preparer may benefit from asking SHPO staff for a good example of a property nomination that is linked to an MPD. The sample nomination will illustrate how and where to reference MPD-related material. For example, the introductory paragraphs of Section 8 should state the name of the MPD, identify the associated property type, and explain how the nominated resource meets both the general and property type-specific registration requirements outlined in the MPD. The preparer may find it useful to quote and cite relevant material from the historic contexts in Section E to supplement the property-specific history. Broad background context already presented in an MPD doesn't need to be fully reproduced in an individual property nomination. In most cases, a reference to the MPD's context coupled with a streamlined summary of the most relevant portions are sufficient. This allows the nomination's context to be shorter and more focused than it might have been if written without the benefit of an MPD. As an example, a nomination for a lodge eligible under the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA MPD should include a reference to the comprehensive background history of New Deal programs in Oregon presented in the MPD, but it doesn't need to present a full historic context like it would if there was no associated MPD. Because the MPD has already done a lot of the work of establishing a significant historic context for Oregon's New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, the individual nomination would primarily focus on the history and development of the lodge itself. Thank you for watching this session on how to use a multiple property document or MPD in Oregon. If you have further questions or want to know more about existing MPDs, please contact National Register staff with the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO. You can email them at orshpo.nationalregisterprogram@oprd.oregon.gov, which is also listed on your screen. Thank you.